The cruise ship Horizon glided through the thick Atlantic fog, its gleaming white hull cutting a pristine line through the pewter-gray waters. Passengers aboard the luxury liner celebrated the start of a week-long Caribbean cruise, blissfully unaware that something was about to go terribly wrong. Elena had booked this trip as a much-needed escape from her high-stress job in New York. The cruise promised relaxation, sunshine, and a complete disconnect from her usual world of deadlines and presentations. The first 2 days passed seemingly normally, but subtle oddities began to accumulate like sediment in her memory. During the first evening's welcome dinner, a waiter accidentally dropped a tray, but the sound of shattering china seemed to be swallowed by an unnatural silence that descended on the dining room, lasting only a moment before conversations resumed as if nothing had happened. Then there were other things, a sudden chill in the otherwise climate-controlled hallways, brief instances where conversations would abruptly mute mid-sentence. Some passengers seemed to vanish when they turned a corner, only to reappear down the hallway. And then there was the crew's strange behavior. One night, Elena overheard whispered conversations among the staff, fragments that didn't make sense. "We can't let them know," one steward said to another, his voice low and urgent. When they noticed her listening, they immediately fell silent, their eyes holding a blank, artificial warmth. She started talking to some of the other passengers she had befriended. An elderly woman at the bar whispered to her about hearing voices in the walls, voices that spoke in languages no one could understand. A young couple mentioned their cabin steward entering their room when they were certain they'd locked the door. The ship's layout became increasingly confusing. Elena would walk down a corridor she was certain she'd traversed earlier, only to find the artwork different, the carpeting slightly altered. Deck maps seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. On the third night, things escalated. During the evening entertainment, the magic show suddenly stopped mid-performance. The magician froze on stage, his smile locked in place, eyes fixed on a point just above the audience's heads. For several long moments, no one moved. Then, as quickly as it had stopped, the show resumed, with no acknowledgement of the bizarre interruption. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. The ship seemed to breathe around her, creaking and shifting in ways that defied the smooth engineering of a modern cruise liner. She decided to walk the corridors, her footsteps echoing in the empty passageways. Perhaps it was the way the lights swayed slightly every now and then, but the artwork on the walls seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at it. Portraits with eyes that followed her, maritime scenes that rippled like water. Suddenly she thought of what she overheard from the crewmen. "We can't let them know." For a while it seemed nothing was amiss, but then, near a restricted maintenance corridor, she noticed something odd. Water was pooled around a maintenance door, and the edges of the door seemed to shimmer, almost translucent. Wet footprints led to and from the door, prints that seemed to fade and reappear as she watched. Curiosity overcame her fear. Elena pushed the door open. The space beyond was impossible. It was larger than the ship's physical dimensions could allow, a vast chamber that seemed to exist in a realm between reality and nightmare. Ghostly figures stood motionless, perfect duplicates of the passengers and crew currently on the horizon. She knew because she recognized one figure, the elderly lady who had told her about the whispers she heard through the walls. The figures were translucent, their forms flickering like old television signals, each one an exact replica down to the smallest detail of clothing and expression. Some stood in mid-conversation, mouths open but no sound emerging. Others were frozen in mundane actions. A waiter about to place a drink on a table, a woman mid-laugh, a child reaching for a toy. They were like a living photograph, capturing a moment that could never move forward. Then slowly, one of the spectral figures turned. Its movement was unnatural, a fluid rotation that defied human mechanics. It looked directly at Elena, and she saw its eyes, ancient, intelligent, filled with a hunger that transcended human understanding. And then it smiled. Elena recoiled in horror. The smile revealed row after row of teeth that seemed to fold back into infinity. Something whispered in the back of her mind. Maybe these figures weren't duplicates. Maybe these were really the passengers, turned. Maybe the horizon was more than a ship. It was a hunting ground for something ancient, and now it had noticed her. The spectral figures began to move. The cruise ship cut through the Mediterranean like a knife, its white hull a deceptive mask of innocence. Andy had booked this trip as a gift to himself. From his divorce, from his failing advertising career, from the endless gray of his life in Chicago. The brochure, which had landed conveniently in his mailbox one day, promised transformation. How terribly right it would prove to be. At first, everything felt surreal in its perfection. The other passengers seemed pleasant, the staff friendly and helpful. But then, Andy started to notice small oddities. The way certain crew members would go momentarily still when they thought no one was watching, as if their attention was suddenly elsewhere. The occasional flicker of something, hunger, anticipation, behind their eyes when they thought no one would notice. Andy also noticed strange symbols in unexpected places. Markings he didn't recognize etched subtly into the brass railings, woven into the intricate carpet patterns, carved almost imperceptibly into the wooden panels of the elegant dining room, sometimes appearing in places he was sure no symbols appeared before. The nightmare started on the third night. Andy would jolt awake, drenched in cold sweat, fragments of dark rituals echoing in his mind, chanting, shadows moving against shadows, the sense of something ancient and hungry watching, waiting. During the day, he tried to shake off the feeling. He'd drink at the bar, chat with fellow passengers, but something felt off. He wasn't sure what brought on his sudden paranoia, but even as he spoke to other guests, he would be aware that the staff seemed to be communicating in silent signals, a particular way of tilting a wine glass, a specific pattern of blinking, coded messages just beyond his comprehension. The ship's chaplain particularly unnerved him, an elderly man with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of terrible knowledge. When he smiled at Andy during evening mass, it was like being examined by something that wasn't entirely human. On the sixth night, the chaplain approached him. Andy had been sitting alone on the observation deck, trying to distract himself from the confusion swirling within him. The old man materialized beside him as if conjured from the darkness itself. No footsteps, no warning. "Beautiful night," the chaplain said. His voice was dry leaves rustling over stone. "You've been watching, observing." Andy turned, suddenly aware of how isolated they were. The deck was empty. The night was absolute. "I don't know what you mean," Andy replied, his lips suddenly dry. The chaplain's laugh was something between a cough and a whisper. "Oh, but you do. Some are chosen to see. Most are not." Up close, the man was impossible to age. His skin seemed both ancient and newborn, translucent, with something moving beneath it that shouldn't move in human flesh. "Chosen for what?" Andy asked despite himself. "Passage," the chaplain said. "Not a journey, not a voyage, a transformation." The word hung between them like a physical thing. Andy felt something cold press against the inside of his skull, a sensation just shy of pain. "The passengers," the chaplain continued, "are not passengers. They are vessels, containers, waiting to be filled." Andy wanted to get up and leave, knowing this conversation was not going where he wanted to be, but he couldn't stop himself in his morbid curiosity. "Filled with what?" The old man's smile split his face like a wound. "Everything that exists between what you understand and what you cannot comprehend." A moment of silence. Then, "Would you like to know more?" Andy knew the correct answer was no. He heard himself say, "Yes." One evening, Andy discovered a door at the end of a corridor he has passed many, many times. But it was as if suddenly it had revealed itself to him, its wooden surface carved with those same strange symbols. The metal handle was impossibly cold when he touched it. Whispers leaked from beneath the door. Not human, something older, darker. He should have walked away. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to return to his cabin. But it was his damn curiosity again. He couldn't turn back now. The door opened with a sound like a dying breath. Inside, darkness moved. Figures in dark robes surrounded a central altar, Candles, a yellowish white like human bone, flickered with pale, green-tinged flames. The chanting was a low, guttural sound that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in his skull. They were conducting a ritual, not of science, not of medicine, but of something far older, far hungrier. And right then Andy felt with sudden primal clarity that this ship was not a ship. It was alive, and it was hungry. It was something waiting to be awakened. Something that had been waiting a very, very long time. Dr. Helen gripped the stainless steel railing, her knuckles white, as the ship's medical center descended into chaos. The first patients had arrived 12 hours ago, seemingly healthy passengers with sudden, violent fevers that spiked to 104 degrees within minutes. "We're losing control," whispered Dan, the senior nurse, as another patient began convulsing on the examination table. The man's skin was mottled, shifting between pale gray and an unnatural bluish green. His muscles spasmed, bones visibly reconfiguring beneath his skin. Helen had seen infectious diseases before, but nothing like this. The symptoms defied every known medical protocol. Blood tests revealed impossible mutations, cellular structures breaking down and reforming in patterns that resembled neither human nor any known biological classification. Captain Harrison made the decision to quarantine Deck 7 by mid-afternoon. The worst of the 200 passengers, sealed behind reinforced medical-grade doors, monitored through thick glass windows. But the containment was already failing. They had no capacity for this scale of operations, and many had to stay in standard passenger cabins. The first signs of true horror emerged when Sarah Jenkins, a retired school teacher, stopped responding to medical intervention. Her body began to change, not gradually but in sudden, horrific bursts. Her fingers elongated, developing webbing between them. Her eyes, once a soft blue, turned a deep, luminescent green with vertical pupils. "It's like some kind of accelerated evolutionary response," Helen muttered, recording her observations. The medical student side of her silently fascinated. But evolution towards what? By nightfall, the ship's communication systems began to fail. Satellite links dropped, radio signals became garbled. The Meridian was becoming a floating tomb, drifting in international waters with no hope of external rescue. As if to push the situation further beyond the realms of reality, the transformed passengers weren't just changing physically. They began to display a terrifying, coordinated intelligence. They moved with purpose, communicating through low, resonant sounds that vibrated through the ship's metal corridors. Those still human realized, with growing terror, that they were being hunted. Dan was the first of the medical staff to notice the strategic nature of their outbursts. The transformed beings worked together, systematically creating chaos in one room to distract the staff while another tried to escape. Collective intelligence. "We won't be able to control them much longer," Helen realized. "They're becoming something else entirely. We have to land." But she knew what she said was merely wishful thinking. They were nowhere near land, and she knew it. It also became impossible to shield knowledge of this horrific predicament from the rest of the passengers. Survivors barricaded themselves in the ship's upper decks, listening to the horrifying sounds echoing through the ventilation systems. Wet, slapping sounds, inhuman clicks and whistles. The crew tried with all their might to ensure the safety of the passengers, but always in the middle of the night, you would hear an occasional human scream, quickly silenced. Helen discovered the critical detail by accident. Blood samples from the initial patients revealed trace amounts of an unknown marine microorganism, something dredged up from the ocean's deepest, darkest regions. A parasite that didn't just infect, it completely rewrote biological programming. By the fifth night, less than 500 passengers remained unchanged. They watched in terror as the transformed beings, no longer truly human, began flooding the lower decks. And the speed of their transformation. In order to find prey, their bodies adapted. They became fluid, capable of squeezing through impossibly small spaces, adapting to the ship's complex architecture. The ocean itself seemed to conspire with them. Thick fog rolled in, obscuring any potential rescue. The ship's position became unknown, drifting in an endless, dark expanse. In the final hours, Helen understood the true horror. This wasn't just an infection, it was a replacement. Whatever was transforming the passengers wasn't interested in coexistence. It wanted complete biological conquest. As dawn broke, the meridian was silent. No distress signals, no survivors broadcasting their location. Just an immense cruise ship drifting in international waters, carrying its transformed cargo, something entirely new, entirely alien. And waiting, patiently, intelligently, to make landfall.